Greetings, mortals. Today we talk about sandboxing. Specifically, what that means, or at least what I mean by it, and I give you 5 tips on how to run a sandbox game all on your own. Welcome to Tabletop Sandbox, where we talk about all things TTRPG. I do not want peace. I want problems. Always. Also known as Harrison Tar. So, what is a sandbox game? I've decided to break this up into 2 interpretations and phrasings of the word sandbox and describe what each of those means to me. I'm referring to these 2 ideas about sandbox gaming as the sandbox and sandboxing. One as a proper noun and one as a verb. So, to start with, the sandbox. The sandbox is what I think most people think of when they think of a sandbox game of any TTRPG. It usually involves an open world. In fact, a lot of people's general opinions about TTRPGs stem from video games in this day and age, or at least that's what I believe. The sandbox has an open world. Usually it has a map with a few locations on it, and it is important to note that the sandbox isn't limitless. It does have walls, and that can be the borders of the map, or it can be defined a little bit more vaguely or less quantitatively, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And oftentimes the sandbox will not have an opening quest to hook the players into the world, or it won't have a main quest that drives them through the campaign from 1st to 20th level or whatever it is in the system you're using. It's usually exploration based, and basically the game master provides this map, gives the players a few details about their starting town and the surrounding area, and says, go ham. Do what you want to, explore, figure out what you want to do, and the players have to pick something and go for it. This interpretation of the sandbox is easily and perhaps essentially fit for hex crawling and or point crawling type games where there are a bunch of interesting locations around the map that your players can go and interact with. But as I said, it doesn't necessarily have to have a main plot line or a main quest line, if you will. The other term and interpretation of the sandbox concept is something that I'm calling sandboxing. And this is much more a style of play than it is a type of campaign. The sandbox is a sandbox type campaign where the whole world and the whole campaign setting is built around this idea of the sandbox. And what sandboxing essentially means is creating a game where your players do not have to hit the right series of buttons in the right order to proceed. Basically what that means is, as the game master, you create problems without distinct solutions in mind, without a correct answer. And I did talk about this a little bit in the video where I talk about what the channel is, but I'll go into it a little bit deeper here. Basically what this means is creating a problem, whether that be a monster or an obstacle or a trap, and not having any answer in mind. Or maybe you do have a few potential solutions in mind, but not determining one of those as the correct answer. Say you put a pit trap in the middle of a 10-foot hallway, and the pit trap is 10 feet wide. It touches both walls of the hallway, and 10 feet, if you're playing a kind of a realistic or low fantasy game, is not something that a player in full armor is going to be able to jump across. So, you've put a trap in this hallway, you know what it's like. It's key here, and this is very OSR, this whole idea of sandboxing actually comes from the dive into the OSR that I've been doing recently. It's important to know how that trap works so that you know if your players do certain things, what will happen. We're gonna say that this pit trap works because there are 2 kind of platforms with counterweights, and if you put a weight of, say, more than 50 pounds on either one of these doors, they both open and dump whoever is standing on top of them into the pit below. And maybe you want to be nasty and put some spikes or even poison spikes down there. You've created a problem, and your next thought might be to develop something like, oh, if they roll a high enough investigation check, they can find the false brick in the wall, pull it off, and flip the lever to deactivate the trap. And that could be something that you decide to do, but personally, I think it's a lot more fun if you just leave it as is, and then present this obstacle in front of your players and see what they do with it. They could send the halfling who weighs less than 50 pounds across and tie a rope to something on the other side and then pull themselves across that rope. They could just try and take one step and then jump across, though that might have not great results. They could bring a 10-foot pole and lay it across this 10-foot gap and walk across it like a tightrope. They could cast spider climb on themselves and go over the wall. They could totally not see this trap coming and fall directly down it, but I would at least give your players a hint of what's ahead without letting them walk straight into it. The idea is you're presenting this problem to your players, and it is up to them to come up with a creative solution. And I think that this is a better way to run your games overall, even if you're not running that typical Sandbox style campaign with the open world and no main storyline. And like I said, this is a play style that can fit multiple campaign types. So if you have a linear storyline, or you have a very character-driven campaign arc, or you just have an exploration-based, no main campaign arc type of game, this sandboxing method can apply to all of those. Really, it's a question of player agency and not creating a correct path for your players to walk down, but rather interpreting their actions and allowing them to try all sorts of things to solve the problems that are in front of them. Now, let me talk about the benefits and drawbacks, specifically of the Sandbox style of play, that open world exploration-based no main storyline type of campaign. First, a downside is that it front loads prep. You have to prepare a whole world, and you need to allow your players to go anywhere in that world if you give them that map. You can't say, oh, you can't go there because that's for a higher level. There aren't invisible walls in this world like there are in MMOs, unless you really wanted to make it like that, but then you're just kind of breaking immersion for your players. So like I said, it front loads prep, but it requires less prep overall in the long run. Next, a downside of the Sandbox campaign type is that there is less guaranteed drama or interesting story. Sure, your players might encounter interesting stories, but there's not going to be a campaign-long story arc that comes to a satisfying conclusion that is built up from the very first session, like there would be if you were running a linear campaign type. But a benefit of this is that it gives the players much more agency and freedom to create their story. It's easier to guarantee drama if you are kind of pulling the strings and running the story as the game master, but it's harder for your players to take agency of that story. If they're just exploring and choosing specifically what they want to investigate, what they want to explore, what they want to devote their time and effort to, then any stories that result are going to be truly theirs and a result of their actions without much input from you as the GM. All you're doing is creating the backdrop and the characters within the play. They're writing the story. And finally, like I said, it's less prep overall, but that doesn't mean you won't have to do prep ever again after you prep that initial map. It is more difficult to prepare for things. It is more difficult to predict where your players are going to go and what they're going to encounter, and therefore it is harder to prep things for your players when you're running a Sandbox style campaign. You kind of have to gauge from your players, maybe by even just asking them at the end of each session, okay, what are you guys planning to do next? And sometimes your players will say that they're going to do something and then decide to do something completely different, and you're still left out to dry without hardly any prep, though hopefully you've done at least a little bit and you have an idea about the place that they're going. But you definitely can start a Sandbox campaign where some of the names on the map you have no additional information about. You just have a general concept and a name on the map. But this less predictable, less preppable style of adventure also means that you as the game master and the players are less limited in the story they can tell and where they can take the story once it begins. As the GM, if you don't do that much prep and you just have a vague idea of different locations, it doesn't hurt nearly as much when your players find a gate into a different plane and they decide to sidetrack their whole adventure and go through there. Except in a sandbox game, they wouldn't have a whole adventure to sidetrack. They're just driving the adventure. And so then you realize, oh, I don't need to prep too much about that city because they may never get there, because right now they're exploring the fire plane. And this could be something that takes most of the campaign and they're already level 15 by the time they come back. And so whatever prep you would have done for that settlement wouldn't even matter at this point. That idea of playing things loose and only barely developing certain areas that the players haven't decided to go to yet, that can be very freeing and less likely to cause DM burnout than if you tried to prep the entire world in detail, and especially if you tried to prep a story that your players are going to follow. And now I have 5 tips that have to do with the sandbox and also sandboxing that will help you be better prepared to run a sandbox game. Number 1 is only prep what you want to run. This applies to both the map that you might give your players and the things that you describe to them. So, if you are putting names of places on a map and there's a desert region to the north that you just throw a bunch of names down on, but you don't actually have any interest in your players going there, skip it. Don't create that part of the map in general, or maybe even just cut your map off and then add that bit to the map when you're ready to run it. Here's a secret: your players can only go to places that you've created, that you have a name for, that you've put on their map. That's actually an evil trick if you're trying to railroad your players, which you should never do, and I've never done even a little bit, I promise. You don't have to force your players to do the specific thing you want them to do. All you have to do is only provide one course of action. If you want them to go to one specific city from the town that they're in, then don't describe any other cities. Only describe that city that you want them to go to. A lack of information creates invisible walls around the things that your players can do, or the places that they can explore. But please, don't use this trick for evil. Only use it for good. Remember, sandboxes have walls, but the players should be free to run around within that sandbox and kick over any sandcastles that they like. Tip number 2, and I already talked about this a bit: create problems, not solutions. This can be a hard way of prepping to get into or to form a habit of, but you'll find that it actually makes your prep a lot less demanding if you're only coming up with problems. And you'd be surprised of what your players can get out of. All you need to do is prep the danger or the problems that they're going to go up against and let them figure out a way to get out of it. This style of play can actually sound a lot more confrontational than it is. The GM coming up with really mean problems without solutions to throw at the players, but it's a style of play that's a lot more fun and collaborative. Because if the GM doesn't have a specific solution in mind, he's not sitting there waiting for the players to stumble across the right answer. He's listening to them coming up with ideas and trying different things and describing them and how they don't work until they stumble across one that does. One that the GM says, oh, I know how this trap works, or I know how this monster works, or what motivations drive this NPC, and this argument or this method of overcoming this trap makes sense and would work. Doing this problem solving where you're all trying to come up with a great idea to answer the problem in front of you is a lot of fun, and it's an easy way to get all your players engaged. But again, as the game master, you have to be open-minded, listening for a solution that could work, not the one you think the players should use. Tip 3. When running the sandbox or just a sandboxing style game, your players are driving the action and they're driving the story. But that doesn't mean you have to leave them alone in your world to do whatever they want. In fact, it's a lot more beneficial if you provide a few options to your players, because odds are you know your world a whole lot better than your players do. Even if you're using a pre-made campaign setting, you've probably spent way more hours reading that content and absorbing it than they have. And so to give them some ideas of even things that their characters would know already, that's something that is just best practices and makes the game more fun for your players. Because if they're sitting there in what they view as a blank room, even though you're seeing it as a colorful tapestry of a world, well, they're not going to have much fun when you say, okay, what do? You have to give them some options, describe the world around them, and suggest some courses of action if they're not able to come up with something on their own. But don't force them to do anything, just give them some ideas. And sometimes your players might take one of those ideas and twist it a way that you never saw coming, and that's part of the joy. Tip number 4, and this one's a key to not letting all those first 3 steps frustrate you to no end, is to leave blanks. I'm pulling this from a Dungeon World principle, which is draw maps, leave blanks, but basically what that means is don't develop everything and don't overdevelop even the things that you're in the midst of using in your game. Only develop the information and the details that you need to run that game at a bare bones. And sometimes you might think you might need a detail, but you can leave that undetermined until it becomes relevant, and then you can decide it in the moment. And giving yourself that freedom, leaving those blanks until it is absolutely necessary to fill those, allows for you to pick things that are much more interesting and fitting to the story that your players are telling than you maybe would have come up with if you prepared it all beforehand. And finally, tip number 5, utilize collaborative and emergent storytelling. Emergent storytelling is one of those buzzwords that's associated with the OSR, and how I have come to understand it, it is not anybody writing a story and then playing it out as you play the game. Rather, it is a story emerging from the things that happen in the game. And OSR relies heavily on random tables a lot of times, and so it's a lot of randomly generated things that happen and then weave themselves together into an interesting story that nobody could have predicted. That's emergent storytelling. But another thing you should rely on when you're running a sandbox game is collaborative storytelling. When you leave blanks, sometimes you come to a situation where you need to fill one of those blanks, and you as a GM are sitting there and there's another blank right in your mind, and you have no idea what to do to fill this blank, to keep the story moving, to provide that detail. And so what do? Do you sit there and make up something not great? Or, here's an option, collaborate with your players. Give your players the option to fill that blank. Say, I'm not really sure what type of monster would be in this crypt, even though I randomly generated that there would be a monster here. What kind of monster do you think would be here? You want to give yourself that option to collaborate with your players and allow them to fill that blank. Let them give you that detail to fill that in, and then they feel more engaged because they're contributing to the world that you're playing in, and you have just taken the weight of creating something absolutely from scratch off of your plate. It's a technique that I love to use because it's a net benefit. And you do have to give up some of that control that you're used to having as a game master, but you as the game master are running the game and you have veto power. You can say, no, that doesn't really make sense within this world. But don't shoot something down just because it's not initially what you thought makes sense in the world. Consider a new idea that you hadn't thought of before and see if you can implement that in a way that is interesting and fits within your world while also utilizing your players' creativity. Well, that's my video on the sandbox and sandboxing. I hope you found some of it interesting or useful, and I hope I gave you some ideas to implement in the next game that you run. Maybe you found some of the ideas in this video objectionable, and I would ask you please share your objections below and let us engage in discourse and conversation. But just in case you agreed with everything I said, let me say something that's definitely going to make you mad. The correct order is milk, then cereal, then bowl. Good night, mortals.